Hello. Welcome to the Ohio State Animal Sciences Podcast. I'm Alec Rush. This is the show where we take an animal science topic and break it down as much as we can until we understand what it is, how it works, and why it's important. Today's subject is a big one for a few reasons, so let's dive in. Reproduction is a critical function of all living things. Arguably, it's the most vital thing every living organism has to do. In order to not go extinct, every species, and not just animals, has to have some way of making more of itself. What we're going to do today is take a quick look at the whole animal kingdom and some of the various ways reproduction gets done. Then we'll take a closer look at a few specific animals and how their reproductive processes are similar and different. Finally, we'll explore some of the ways that we've used technology in this area. From an evolution standpoint, animals need to reproduce. Over millions of years, animals have developed traits that help them survive individually, but they also acquired traits that increase their chances of reproducing, therefore making survival as a species more likely. And just as there is an incredible variety of traits in species across the animal kingdom, there is an incredible variety of reproductive strategies. Reproduction happens in a ton of different ways, but the goal is always the same, for a species to make more of itself. The very first living beings were single-celled organisms, and they reproduced by simply dividing. Imagine how strange it would be if that's how all life still reproduced. But no, for evolved life, the reproductive processes are now far more sophisticated. While there are hugely varied means of reproduction, a lot of them have things in common, which makes sense in terms of evolution. We know how fertilization works in mammals, with sperm cells fertilizing an egg cell in the female's body. The egg develops into a fetus, which doesn't see the light of day until it's born. But with reptiles and birds, the egg is laid and the offspring hatches from it later. Yet another variant of this is in some types of fish, where the unfertilized eggs are laid first, and then the male fish fertilize them externally. As you can see, there is a similar blueprint for each species, but different processes have evolved to suit the needs of different types of animals. But not all animals reproduce in a way that seems familiar to us. There are some pretty strange cases out there. For example, in seahorses, it is actually the male that gives birth. Some animals have asexual methods of reproduction, meaning it does not involve the fusion of gametes, such as egg and sperm cells. An example of one such animal is the sea sponge. Okay, so that was a very broad sweep of all kinds of animals, and a cursory glance at some of the varied reproductive strategies the animal kingdom has to offer. So let's take a more in-depth look at some more familiar animals. One important distinction in terms of reproduction is seasonal versus non-seasonal. Some animals, like cattle, pigs, and rodents, are non-seasonal breeders. They have estrus or hormone cycles throughout the year, allowing them to reproduce whenever. Other animals, like sheep, goats, horses, and deer, are seasonal breeders, meaning they only have estrus cycles during specific seasons, so they can only reproduce during those specific times. Another important concept is reproductive behavior. This could be any activity or change in behavior relating to reproduction or an animal's hormone cycle. One interesting example of reproductive behavior is the presence of homosexual behavior in some species. Reproduction is also very important for the production of food products. For example, hens laying eggs is part of their reproductive process, although the eggs you buy in the store are unfertilized, so you don't have to worry about them hatching. Another example is milk. A cow has to be pregnant to produce milk. Now let's talk about technology. We've covered some forms of technology in previous episodes, but now we're going to really focus on reproduction. This is something we've touched on but never explored in detail. For example, I've mentioned artificial insemination before, but now we're going to put it into the context of a whole group of reproductive technologies. Artificial insemination, along with the freezing of semen samples, allows for much more precision when it comes to reproduction and artificial selection. That is, the choosing of specific traits by humans and breeding animals strategically to maximize those traits. As I mentioned in a previous episode, thanks to this technology, the semen of an animal with desirable traits can be shipped across the world. Technologies similar to those we discussed in the precision technology episode are also very useful when it comes to reproduction. Trackers that can monitor various conditions in animals can be used to track hormone and reproductive cycles. Embryo transfer is another big example of reproductive technology. There are two types: in vivo, in which the egg is fertilized within an animal, and in vitro, in which the egg is fertilized outside the body in a lab. Embryo transfer is also something that is done with humans, and is a viable strategy for people who can't conceive. One last reproduction technology I'd like to bring up is cloning. This one isn't utilized to the same degree as the other examples I mentioned, but it is possible, and in some cases it is done. A sheep named Dolly was the first mammal to be successfully cloned in Scotland in 1996. More recently, another example of cloning is in the sport of polo, where clones of the same mare have been used to gain an advantage in the game. And that just about brings us to the end of our exploration of reproduction. We talked about the concept as a whole and why it's important to evolution. We covered some of the various reproductive strategies in the animal kingdom before focusing on a few specifics. And we took a look at some types of reproductive technologies. This is a big topic, but hopefully this helped you get a better idea of why it's important. This has been the Ohio State Animal Sciences Podcast. I'm Alec Rush, and as always, thank you for listening.